Last week we mentioned the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Essenes, and we'll mention some more about them today, hopefully. Mention the Sanhedrin and one more group of Jews, even though they weren't always Jews, that I wanted to mention at least one more time was the publicans. We've mentioned them before. The publicans are sometimes called the tax farmers for the Romans, and they were officials of the Roman government, and they got to be an official of the Roman government by going to Rome and bidding on the job, if you will, of collecting taxes for the Roman government. And they would go to the Roman Senate and make their bid, and it was a money bid, and the highest bidder won. And their job was they had to deliver a specified amount of money to the Roman government every year. And they were to get that money by collecting taxes from the citizens, or the citizens and non-citizens, all the people that lived in the district or the area that they had contracted for. And their contract was to deliver a set amount of money, and they were allowed to tax any amount they could to get that money, whatever percentage they thought they could get away with in many cases. And they were allowed to and expected to collect more than the taxes they owed to the Roman government, and that excess was considered their salary or their pay. But the Romans didn't regulate that at all, apparently. And so they were able to excise any tax amount they wanted from the people that lived in their district. Well, this left room for a lot of, shall we say, greed, and many of them took advantage of that. And many of them became very, very wealthy. Another job of the publicans was, beyond collecting taxes, they were also in charge of public works. Sometimes this involved building buildings. It involved building roads many times. It involved sometimes building docks or harbors. And sometimes it involved supplying food and supplies to the army that was stationed in their area. And they would take care of this. And that way they were responsible for what we call even today public works. And they took care of the money for that, collected the taxes, and spent it appropriately. As I say, though, many times they collected more than they needed. They became very wealthy. The publicans were almost universally disliked by the Jews. Not that the IRS is popular today, but I think the publicans are a lot less popular in that day, because our government has some, even though they're very complicated and very extensive, there are rules on how much we pay in taxes. People try to get around them. Well, in the first century with Roman control, if you tried to get around the taxes that the publican came to charge you, all he had to do was call a few Roman legionnaires, and if you didn't pay your taxes, you broke Roman law, and you were subject to prosecution. And if you weren't a Roman citizen, they could do just about anything they wanted to without even a trial sometimes. So the publicans were very powerful in the community, and many of them took advantage of that. We have several publicans mentioned in the New Testament, but not all of them were bad. Matthew was a publican. A man named Zacchaeus was a publican. And when he talked to Jesus, he mentioned that, if he defrauded anyone, he paid back 4 times as much, and he supported the poor. So he was, at least after meeting Jesus, after that, he was a good man. He was still a publican. Matthew, I have to assume, was a good man before and after he was a publican. He stopped being a publican when Jesus called him. Many, many times in Judea, the publicans were Jews. And the Jews hated them not only because they charged taxes, but because they were seen as being allies with the Romans, who many Jews didn't really like. So they were, I say, almost universally despised. They're mentioned in the New Testament many times with sinners. You read passages with the publicans and the sinners. They were assumed to be corrupt. They were assumed to be sinners. Jesus was accused of, being with publicans and sinners, like it was a bad thing. But I say not all publicans are bad. One more, we read about the Pharisee and the publican saying prayers. Who had the better prayer in that story? It was the publican. The Pharisee was very arrogant, and the publican was not. And Jesus said his prayer was better. So publicans were, by the public, by the people, condemned and not liked a lot. They almost hated. They probably were hated. But not all of them were bad. Anyway, I want to move on into now some literature that was written in the time between the Testaments. Some of these you may not have ever heard of. Some of them I'm almost certain you have. I want to begin with one. It's just a type of literature. It's called Alexandrian allegorism. And until I studied all this, I hadn't even heard of that. But it has to do with allegories. An allegory, you've heard of a metaphor in English. A metaphor is an expression of an understanding of one concept in terms of another, like anger is sometimes, or fire is sometimes used as a metaphor for anger. He was burning with anger. We understand that. That's a metaphor. Or doing that just added fuel to the fire. So that's a metaphor. An allegory is an extended metaphor. Something like a story about something earthly that tells something spiritual. These parables would fall under these, but many of the writings that were made in the time between the Testaments that are considered to be these Alexandrian allegories weren't parables. They were stories that tried to make things they wanted to do acceptable unto God by telling a story about it. Two of the great allegorizers were named Aristobulus and Philo. And these men, and many of the others like them, considered the literal meaning of the scriptures to be vulgar, misleading, and insufficient. So they were seeking what they called a hidden, deeper meaning. And this hidden, deeper meaning was something that would agree with what they wanted it to agree with. They transformed the scriptures into a manual of philosophy, and they rationalized their views. A lot of them were Hellenistic views, Greek views, with the scriptures. So what they did was they tried to make their personal thoughts, desires, and activities jive with the scriptures by telling stories about them and trying to make the people understand that what I'm doing is okay because it goes along with the scriptures, because it's kind of like this. But they were trying to make the scriptures say what they wanted them to say. We have a lot of that today. People want to take one scripture and make it say what they want it to say. Yes, ma'am. Yes, and these people, like many today, tried to make their wisdom more important than the wisdom of God. So we see that today in our society, but this was prevalent in the Greek culture that still existed in the time between the Testaments and even into the first century in Judea. This type of allegory, I found one writing that said it actually later influenced the church more than it did Judaism, and it contributed to the apostasy and would dominate Roman Catholic thinking. I don't know a whole lot about the Roman Catholic Church, but I do know that they have a lot of rules that we don't find in the Bible, and they consider them to be sacred, kind of like the oral traditions of the Pharisees. They considered them to be more sacred than the scriptures. Another type of literature that appeared in that 400 years between the Testaments, and I hope I pronounce this right, it's called pseudepigrapha. The pseudo means, false. And they include the writings of the Apocrypha and others. Some things called the Book of Jubilee, the letter of Orestes, the Book of Adam and Eve, the martyrdom of Isaiah, First Enoch, Second Enoch, Second Baruch, Third Baruch, something called the Assumption of Moses. And I've never heard of most of these. Some I have heard of, Third Maccabees and Fourth Maccabees. They were written in the time between the Testaments, having to do with the Maccabean revolt and the activities of the Maccabees. And they're considered to be pretty accurate historically, but that's all there are, stories of history. And there's problems in them and contradictions even within them. There was another one called the Psalms of Solomon, 151st Psalm, Psalm 151, which is not in our Bible. And there's one called the Fragment of the Zadokite Work. So I had not heard of most of these, but these were written in the time between the Testaments, and some of them affected things and the beliefs of people. And some are, even to this day, like the Maccabees, the books of Maccabees, are regarded as historical documents that tell us something about what happened in that 400 years between the Testaments that we don't find anywhere else. So, like I say, these were things that had more or less some effect and sometimes greater effect on the first century and the Jews in the first century. The most well-known pseudepigrapha is something called the Apocrypha. Some Bibles, particularly Bibles given out by the Catholic Church, have the Apocrypha in them, and they're usually placed in the Bible between the Old Testament and the New Testament. That word Apocrypha means hidden or secret, and you may have a Bible or seen them that have the Apocrypha in them. The Jews, and I want to emphasize this, the Jews of that time never considered the Apocrypha to be inspired or part of their scripture. They were often included as historical reference, and indeed they may have some accurate history in it, but there are many, many contradictions in there, and they have never been considered part of the Jewish Bible or the Hebrew Bible. They were not even considered by anyone to be scriptural or be inspired or canonical until 1546 AD, when the Roman Catholic Council of Trent assembled and declared them to be canonical, and thus they included them in the Bible. But that was well after the first century, well after the New Testament was written, and today they're still not considered to be inspired by almost anyone except maybe the Catholic Church. Perhaps the Greek Orthodox Church, and there was one or two more I read about, but the Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church are the main ones that considered those to be really a part of the Bible. No one else did until, that Council of Trent. I mentioned some of those. There's like 4 books of Maccabees. There's one called the Ecclesiasticus by Sirach, and it's actually the only one of those books in the Apocrypha that the author is actually known. All the others, the author's really not unknown. There's a book called Tobit, one called Judith. There's some additions to the book of Esther. There's one called The Song of Three Young Men, one called Susanna, one called Bel and the Dragon. I'm not kidding you. I've never read it. I don't know what it says. And there's one called The Prayer of Manasseh. But again, these are included in some Bibles today and listed and printed between the Old and New Testaments. But I want to emphasize one more time, they have never been considered to be inspired or canonical by anybody except primarily the Catholic Church. The most important, in my opinion, document written in the time between the Testaments is called the Septuagint. Now, the Septuagint is the oldest known translation of the Hebrew Old Testament. And I've mentioned it before. It was translated from the Hebrew into the Koine Greek. It was done in Alexandria. After Alexander died, the Greek Empire was split into 4 pieces, and the the general that got the southern part, which was Egypt and part of Judea, was Ptolemy. And all the kings of that kingdom, that part of the Grecian Empire, came to be called Ptolemies. And one of them, named Ptolemy Philadelphus, decided that to keep the Jews happy in Alexandria, and there were many of them there. Matter of fact, during his time, there were probably more Jews in Alexandria than in Jerusalem. He issued a decree that the Hebrew Bible would be translated into the Greek. It was done by 70 men. Sometimes you'll hear the Septuagint referred to as the LXX. LXX is the Roman numeral for 70. Septuagint comes from the Roman name word for 7. That's septem. September's our 9th month, but it wasn't always that way until Julius Caesar changed the calendar. It was the 7th month. Nonetheless, Ptolemy Philadelphus, also called Ptolemy II, sent to Jerusalem and brought Jewish scholars. And the numbers are usually called, there were 70 of them. Some people say there were 72 because he had the same number from each tribe. But these scholars were brought to Alexandria and told to translate the Hebrew Bible, Hebrew Old Testament, into Greek. And they began in about 285 BC to do this. The first 5 books were the first ones they translated. It took them about 2 years to do that. And that's what's known as the Pentateuch: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And they were translated, first ones translated, which makes sense. In time, all the Old Testament, the Hebrew Old Testament, will be translated into the Greek. The Jews, most of them actually liked this. By the time Ptolemy Philadelphus was reigning, Alexander's dream was that the whole world be living under Greek philosophy and ideas, and it was happening. And many Hebrews were becoming like Greeks, becoming Hellenistic, and they were speaking the Greek language. And the children in Alexandria, the Hebrew children, were being taught the Greek language and speaking it, and many of them were beginning to forget the Hebrew language. Well, if they didn't know the Hebrew language, they would not be able to read the Hebrew scriptures. So the Jews, many of them welcomed this. This gave the opportunity for their children who knew only Greek in time to be able to read the Old Testament. And so they went along with it and were happy to have it. You can read many things about the rules that the Jews followed to translate. They translated mostly, from the old Hebrew text. Many of them were written on, I lost the word, skins. There's another word for that, though. Animal skins. Many were written on plant papyrus. And papyrus is a plant that grows in Africa, particularly along the Nile. And they would take the stem, take the center of that stem, and flatten it out. And it had long strings of fiber going through it. And they would lay them beside each other, and sometimes they would then cover that with another layer going, 90 degrees opposite of that, so it would hold together. And the gum that was in that plant fiber was like glue and hold it together. And for many years, the Egyptians, when they started writing down things, that was their paper. and they would use that. The Jews also used that. They also used animal skins, and these, when they translated, some of the rules were they would go very slowly, go letter by letter, word by word, and they would have what I'd call a proofreader. And if they had translated the page and they had it proofread, and if one mistake was found, they just trashed it and started over again. So they were very meticulous about translating the Hebrew Old Testament, and used those rules. They were called their scribes. They used those rules of being a scribe to translate the Hebrew Bible. And they did so to maintain the integrity of the Hebrew Old Testament. So I say that it took a long time, a number of years, but they finally did that. And they wanted to make sure they were exact. Ptolemy Philadelphus, when he saw the Pentateuch, the translation of the Pentateuch, he gave the Jews great thanks, sent them back to Jerusalem, but told them they'd have to come back and do the rest over the next few years, and that they did. We have only a few fragments of this original translation of the Septuagint remaining, and they are in museums around the world, some in England, some in Cairo. Some have been identified as being among the Dead Sea Scrolls, and we'll talk some more about those in a little while here. When Christianity began to be spread in the first century, the Old Testament that was used by most of the Jews by that time was the Septuagint. It was considered by the Jews to be extremely accurate to the Old Hebrew text. It was considered, and most people spoke Koine Greek, so it was written in a universal language. Everybody could understand it. Most of the quotations of the Old Testament that are found in the New Testament are from the Septuagint. Many of the quotations that Jesus himself made of Old Testament prophecies were direct quotations from the Septuagint. So it was, like I say, it was considered then by the Hebrews to be extremely accurate, and they trusted it. The good thing for us is that it's still today regarded as being a highly reliable translation of the Hebrew Old Testament into the Greek, and is, I say it's considered to be probably the most reliable translation of the Hebrew into the Greek. So we can have a good, confident feeling that the Old Testament we have is truly what the Hebrews had way back when the prophets wrote it. Now it's gone through, of course, to get to English, it had to go through into the Greek. Then there was, I guess, the first big one after that was called the Latin Vulgate. It was written in Latin, translated from the Greek in Latin, from the Septuagint in Latin, and then from the Latin and the Septuagint, basically those two documents, into English. And of course, we have several English translations today. And as a side note, several of those English translations, there's two philosophies. One philosophy of translation is to translate the thought that's in the old scriptures into English. The other philosophy is to literally translate the words into English. The problem with using those that have the philosophy that I'll translate the thought that is meant into the English words is that their opinions can get into that very, very easily. So it's better, in my opinion, and many opinions of Christians today, I mean members of the church, that it's better to have, much better to have what is called a literal translation. Now you can't have a literal translation from the Koine Greek into the English in the order that the words are written in Greek, because Greek orders their language in a different order. Our English, many times, most of the time, you have a subject, a verb, a predicate. But in Greek, sometimes the verb is at the end of the sentence. And that's true of other foreign languages. So what the translator would have to do is get the Greek and see what it says, translate it to English words, and arrange it so that it conforms to modern English. The words are very much the same or almost identical, and many times they are checked against old manuscripts or old documents, even against documents that still survive from the Septuagint. I just took a Greek class up in where we at Winnsboro. There we go, and I saw some samples of what's written on papyrus, and we looked at some examples of what's written on papyrus. That's part of some of the Old Testament Hebrew, and different men wrote in kind of different styles. By that I mean some had noticeable spaces between the words. Others had the space was so small you couldn't hardly tell it was space between words. And with the Greek alphabet, as I've now learned, there's many different ways. There's more than one way to write some of the letters. One letter, phi, is a circle with a line straight down through the middle. But some people wrote that as a circle, and they come on around and just curl it around like that. So there's little differences in people's style of writing. It's like your style of writing English or printing English. If I got two or three of us together and we were writing down the same words in English, in cursive, or by printing, the letters may not look identical, especially mine, because I'm terrible with writing. But what the translators have to do today is look at the oldest documents that we have, and many that consist of the Septuagint, and look at those papyrus writings and make sure they've done the best job they can. And we looked at some of that in the class I took, and I wasn't catching things. I had looked and I said, well, what is that word? I can't even tell what the letters are, because he wrote them in a different manner than I learned it. And then someone in the class noticed, look down here, here's the same word. And you could tell by the context, that's what it is. It is the same word. There's apparently a whole science of study on translating from papyrus, because they always wrote in black ink, but the ink would kind of sink in. And sometimes some of the older documents, they actually would go back and change it and change one letter. And you'd have one letter and then it soaked in. And then when they wrote over it, it was a different letter. And it made it even more difficult. So there's a lot of science and study and scrutiny that went into and goes into translating the Bible. In the end, I have to conclude that the Lord is going to make sure we have an opportunity to read the Bible as it should be. And I believe we have several good English translations today. The oldest one, the most widely used one, is King James. And it was translated from a Greek text called the Textus Receptus. And way back in 1611, when King James of England commissioned that translation, they used the latest Hebrew, or the latest Greek, or the oldest Greek text, I say, that they had available to translate. And for the most part, did a very, very good job. The biggest problem that I have with the King James is it used the Old English language, these and thous and wast and hast and all those. I understand what they mean, but that's not the way we speak English today. But nonetheless, it is considered a very reliable translation and very, very true to the Koine Greek. The New King James is considered to be very good also. The American Standard Translation in 1901 is considered to be maybe even more accurate to the Old Greek. Other documents between 1611 and 1901 were discovered and they comprise what's called the morphological Greek New Testament. For the most part, and you can look these up, for the most part, I mean like 99% of the time, the words are identical with the Textus Receptus, what was used to translate the King James. But there are a few differences. A few words are left out here and there. A few verses are left out here and there. In your Bible today, you may see while you're reading a word in italics. That word in italics, if you look at the beginning of the Bible and read the prefix there, it means that the translators inserted a word there that wasn't there in the Greek, but they inserted it to help you understand what the Greek word meant. In some Bibles, the one I use, the New American Standard, in a few places, a verse has brackets around it. And that is a verse that's not included in all the ancient manuscripts. I guess the one I remember the most is when Jesus was on the cross, and it says he was crucified between thieves. And then a verse says, thus the scripture was fulfilled, he was numbered with transgressors. Your translation may not have that verse. And if you look at the numbering of the verses, it actually just skips a number. It doesn't affect the understanding of the Bible or anything that's going to affect your salvation. But there are a few verses that aren't in all the Greek transcripts that were used. But I say primarily the Septuagint's used. Jumping ahead a little bit, there was after the Septuagint was translated, which is about 285 to so or 250 BC, other Hebrew texts were found in caves and such, and we'll talk some more about specifically some of those. And it was found that they agreed remarkably with the documents that were used in the Septuagint, and in most cases, word for word they agreed. There were a few different words here and there, but it was like 99% of the time they agreed. Thus, the Greek text that we have is the Septuagint, and the Hebrew text, what remains of those that were used to translate Greek into the Greek. And these later documents were found by archaeologists agree almost exactly. And it actually should make us feel better that those words were maintained throughout history. And sometimes they were discovered by archaeologists, but they still agree with each other, which should make us feel better about the origin of our Bible and how we got it and that we can depend on it. All those texts I talk about there later, they were considered today to be the Masoretic text, and it's used by Jews today for the Old Testament instead of the Septuagint, which is in Greek. They still use the Masoretic text, which is in Hebrew. But again, the Septuagint and the Masoretic texts agree almost 99% of the time on exactly what was said, whether it's in Greek or Hebrew. Some more support for the Septuagint and for the Bible that we have today came much later in history. I mentioned last week a group of Jews called the Essenes. They are not mentioned in the Bible. They were a group that came to be in the time of the Maccabees. They resented Roman rule. They did not like it. They didn't like the Greeks ruling. They certainly hated Antiochus Epiphanes, as many Jews did. But they went to an extent where they would live away from everybody else. They lived in what we might call today monasteries. They weren't big buildings, so they were just small buildings and huts in the mountains. And they lived in an area on the northwest side of the Dead Sea, and they considered themselves to be above all the other Jews. They were following the law exactly, but they were making it bending the law to make it fit their way of life. Many times they did not marry. They say they lived alone. They didn't mix with other Jews. Well, when the Romans started gaining power, and these Essenes were very much like the Pharisees in that they believed that they should be following the law of Moses, all of it. And they made many copies of the laws of Moses so to have for themselves. Well, when they saw that the Romans were coming and were about to take over Jerusalem, they took many of their documents, many of their scrolls. They were written on skins, parchments, that's the word I was looking for. Parchments, which are skins, they were written on papyrus, and they put them in clay pots and hid them in caves. And then they left the area and more or less disappeared from history. But many, many years later, in 1947, that's the 1947 that I wasn't born then, but I was getting close. In 1947, a Bedouin Arab sheep herder, or goat herder actually, had lost a goat and was looking for the goat, and found a cave that he thought the goat might have gone into. And when he went into this cave looking for his goat, he found clay pots. And inside those clay pots were scrolls. And when he looked at them, he noticed they were very old, so he went and told people about it. And eventually, educational authorities went and looked at them and confirmed, yes, these were ancient Hebrew text. Well, not all Hebrew, some written in Greek. And they came to be known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. Now, these all originated in the time between the Testaments, but they were not discovered until 1947. And for about 20 years, archaeologists kept looking for more and more, and they found many. And I think there was eventually found 11 caves with these documents within. Many were parchments, many were papyrus. One was made out of copper, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes, because it was kind of a different one. Obviously, it wasn't the same material. But these Dead Sea Scrolls began to be translated out of the Hebrew, and some were written in Greek. And as they were translated, the parts that they found, they were parts, sometimes, most of them were parts of Old Testament books. One or two were entire books. Parts of every Old Testament book, except Esther, I believe, were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And what the people that studied them found out was they also agreed to a very, very large extent with what the Septuagint had. Thus again, reinforcing the thought that those Hebrew translators back in the days of Ptolemy Philadelphus did a very, very good job, and that we can trust what they did, because this is several centuries later, like 2,300 years or so, that documents found hadn't changed in that time, agreed with what was done then. About 5 minutes, I'll finish up a few things here on the Dead Sea Scrolls. Some of the Dead Sea Scrolls actually included the Apocrypha, but again, they were never considered by anybody to be inspired. The one unusual scroll was that copper one. And I'll mention this because it was very unusual. It had nothing to do with Scripture. It was written on very, very thin copper foil. It was rolled up, and it was very brittle. And to unroll it, they actually had to cut it into strips and then kind of flatten each one and put it together. And what it contained was a list of 64 hiding places where the Jews had allegedly hidden gold and silver and the treasures from the temple. And of course, people have been looking for these 64 different hiding places based on what they read in that copper scroll ever since. And to this day, not one of them has been found. At least for what I found, no one's ever found them. So did the Essenes just make that up? Or did they actually hide things everywhere? Now, they didn't want the Romans to get anything. That's why they hid their scrolls. That's why they abandoned where they lived. So the Romans would find nothing of value from the Jews. So were there 64 caves? My guess is as good as yours. I would say there probably were, or maybe not caves, but hiding places. The gold, silver, and temple treasures, no one's ever found them. That's since the 1950s. I would imagine there have been several people trying to find them. But it was the only scroll that was written on something other than parchment or papyrus. But again, the Dead Sea Scrolls are great evidence that what we have in our English Bibles today, which came from Greek text, is what the Hebrews had for the Old Testament way back when in the first century. So we can have confidence of that. Again, urge us, when we pick a translation to use in English today, use one that, if you go and read the preface to the Bible, it'll say something about they tried to do a literal translation. Words in the Bible tells us, the Bible scripture tells us that every word was inspired of God. So every word's important. But we can feel pretty confident with several translations in English that we have the actual Word of God and what He intended. There are differences, but in our English translations, minor ones, like the New King James took out a lot of the Old King James, Old English. By the way, if you ever see a part of the original King James Version, it was written in Old English, and it looks nothing like our English today. The lettering is different. The words are the same, but it's a very different style of writing, and the letters are different. And kind of like the Greek, if an S came at the end of a word, it was a totally different character. But I can't remember the year. It was sometime after 1611 when King James was still alive and said to modernize the King James Version. And that's basically what we have today. But what they did was they took that Old English alphabet and translated it or converted it into the more modern English alphabet. So many things that happened, many documents written in the time between the Testaments, we don't use directly today, but they indirectly affected us, and they certainly directed activities, attitudes, and actions of the Jews in the time of the first century. And thus they would affect the beginning of the church, and they would affect how the Bible was spread, how the gospel was spread. Next week, as I said, I want to talk about some things, just some odds and ends of where did that come from. First one I've got in my notes is the Feast of Dedication. It's mentioned in the New Testament, but what was it? We'll talk about that. Thank you for your attention, and our time is up, so we will now be dismissed.